Thank you for joining us. It was over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of federal money that has flowed into the state. And so from conversations with some of our members, we thought it might be a good idea to have an information session on single audits. As you may know, unless you get $750,000 or more in federal funds, there's no requirement that you do an audit unless perhaps your funder requires that. And I think the concern was there might be several organizations that have never got to that 750,000 threshold, but through the rescue and relief funds that have flowed in, they've crossed that threshold. And so we just want them to be prepared. And so we reached out to our friends at Seim Johnson and said, hey, do you know anybody that can help us with this? And they said, we got just the person here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Justin Hope with Seim Johnson, and he's going to kick things off. So thanks, Justin.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ann. That was quite the sell. So I hope I can deliver on this today. But Ann is right. There are a ton of organizations that I work with, that I hear anecdotally, who maybe never had federal funds even before, and all of a sudden are swimming in a pool of funding, and there's a lot of uncertainty around all of this funding that's come out, and we'll touch on those things into the future slides that we're going to work through. So I want to kind of put a little disclaimer out there. I do quite a bit of this kind of work. I am not the authoritative guidance issuer, so these are probably my opinions as much as anything, but we'll just kind of leave it at that. So if we get to a burning question that we don't get time to address, something pops up, when you can't sleep tonight about, my gosh, I wish I would have asked this. My email is here. Please reach out. I'll be happy to talk through any of those kind of situational sort of things. So when Ann and I were talking about this, probably about a month ago, kind of putting this together, our questions is, well, this is new for so many organizations, and I sit through an inordinate amount of continuing ed on this topic in a regular year, and then throw in the pandemic on the last 2 years and all of the new funding, changes to funding, rules, all these different things that have been going on. This has really got to be confusing from a grantee's perspective, from a recipient organization. What do they need to know? What do they need to worry about? And so I kind of tried to come at it from that perspective of what on earth is a single audit? What are we doing here? What does that involve from both the recipient perspective and the auditor perspective, from my seat, what I do? What's the end result? What's the point of all of this stuff? And then, of course, COVID made everything complex, and that is not unique to the single audit and the federal grant space. That is also more complex than it used to be, and it was complex to start with. I have a couple of slides on some guidance, some general broad brush statements of look at these things, don't look at these things kind of information. And then if we get to it, I have a couple of slides with some links and some resources to find some more info about some of what's been a little bit more common grants over the last couple of years. So thinking about this and writing on these slides, I was reminded of the scariest 9 words in the English language, and that's, we're from the government and we're here to help. And that's been pretty applicable over the last couple of years with the way that some of these things have gone. And so, well, what is a single audit? And so it's something that gets required by this long explanation. The summary version is, it's called the Uniform Guidance, and it sets out all the rules and regulations of what are you supposed to do with a federal award. And you're required to do one of these single audits, as Ann mentioned, when you expend in excess of $750,000 in federal awards in any fiscal year. And so those 2 words in red are pretty key points that we're going to touch on here in a couple of slides. And that 750 really is the magic number. If you are 749, 999, no single audit requirements. If you are $750,001, single audit. And so there's no judgment around that number. You say, well, we're just over the bar. Tough single audit. You're under the bar. Fantastic job managing your grants, and you don't have to do a single audit for this fiscal year. I actually have a couple of clients that do really unique programs, and they don't always, for what it is that they do, they don't always have grant expenses in a particular year. And so we've kind of worked with them and said, hey, let's be mindful of our grants. And if you're going to get close, let's get over, or trying to manage that process of around that $750,000 number. And so it's something to consider. And, you know, to expand on that, do your good deeds, do your mission, complete your mission, and do what your organization needs to do, and don't manage to that 750. But sometimes you can get close to the end of the year, and there's a little bit of gamesmanship you can work on to try and stack a single audit into one year and not the other, different things. But we'll get into that. And so why are we going to do one of these single audits? What's the purpose of this? And so it's a way for the federal government to make sure the grant's getting used in accordance with the way that they wrote the grant agreements, the terms, the conditions of those things. And so this uniform guidance lays out very specific prescriptive requirements on the auditors, my world, about how we have to go through one of these, and the process and procedures and things related to that. And so if we dive on the terminology a little bit, single audits are generally based on the expenditures of federal awards and not the receipt of cash. And that's a key distinction here. So a lot of the grants that have come out recently are effectively have been, here's a giant pile of cash, spend it. We'll tell you later what you were supposed to have done with it. And oh, by the way, it's not a federal award. Now it is a federal award. Now it's not a federal award. So it's been really confusing to kind of try to keep track of these things. So pre-pandemic, the process is generally nonprofit applies for a grant, either directly with the funding agency or maybe with somebody like the city of Omaha, places like that. You get approved for the grant. You have a specific budget, you have outcomes or goals attached to that project that says, here's what we're going to be able to do with this grant funding. And then typically the organization, the nonprofit, will spend the money for the grant, be that salaries, overhead costs, you know, program specific things according with that budget that you submitted when you went after the grant. You spend the money, then you fill out a request form, and the funder pays you back for that effectively. And in the case of that, your revenue always equals your expense. When I spend the dollar that qualifies under the grant, the funding agency is obligated to repay me that. So I have some revenue and receivables, and then when I bill it, collect it, and all that fun stuff. So this COVID funding has made a bit of a mess. I must have been feeling charitable when I wrote this slide. It's made a horrific mess out of this. The CARES Act, the Family First Coronavirus Relief Act, American Rescue Plan. We were fielding calls. My office, we do quite a bit of healthcare work, hospitals around the region, and we would field phone calls from our hospital clients, and they would call and they say, well, Justin, I looked at my bank statement this morning and I got $3 million from the federal government. Do you know what this is? They hadn't applied for it. They hadn't requested it. They had no budget. They had no idea what they were supposed to do with it. And I said, well, let me turn to my friends at Google and we'll see what we can find what they did. And you would kind of have to back into these calculations of how did some of these organizations even get this money? And did they get the right amount or too much or not enough? And that has been a horrific mess through this, and conflicting and changing guidance has always been helpful through this process too. So moving on, what is a federal award? And so that was kind of the other key piece of that slide a couple slides ago here, expenditures, which we were talking about, and then of a federal award. And so a federal award is financial assistance that you get either directly from a federal awarding agency or indirectly from a pass-through entity. And so an example of this direct, FEMA has been making grants lately. And so nonprofits will send an application to FEMA, and FEMA will choose to fund or not fund the grant. That would be considered a direct federal award. It came directly from the federal agency to the recipient nonprofit. You can also have indirect or pass-through grants. And this is where an example of this, and a good one, and it'll tie into some slides we have coming up here, and a common one in this area, HUD, the Housing and Urban Development, makes a big grant to the city of Omaha. And then the city of Omaha turns around and makes sub-grants out to nonprofits. This could be things like weatherization. A really big one in the area has been the emergency rental assistance. I have a handful of clients involved in that process, to where the funds come from HUD to the city to the nonprofit. So there's another layer in there. But because it did not come from directly from a federal agency, doesn't mean it's not a federal award. They're not always cash. A lot of times they are, but it could be a loan guarantee or mortgage insurance. HUD is famous for this one, also the USDA, where they'll guarantee certain kinds of mortgages for entities, and that becomes a federal award. It could be food assistance, food commodities, goods, things like that. If you think about local school districts and the school lunch program, oftentimes there are commodity foods that get gifted or given to the school districts that is considered federal awards. And so the important thing about these, and the way to find more information, is they're all identified by this federal financial assistance listing number. And it's 2 numbers and a period followed by 3 numbers. And so the leading 2 identify the awarding agency, where did it come from? And then the last 3 identify the specific grant or the program. And so if you have this information, oftentimes, again, Google can be your friend. You can put in the FFAL number and Google that and find more information about the grant, links to the federal agency's websites and different things where you can get some more detailed information. As an auditor, this is supremely helpful to me when there's not a ton of information on a grant, or it's maybe a new program at your organization, and it's just getting up and running. And so this is a good way to be able to gather up some more info on those grants. And so some common identifiers, again, that leading 2 identifies the agency. You'll see 10 is the USDA. 14 is Housing and Urban Development. We were just talking about it. 16, DOJ. 17 is the DOL. 21 is one that until 2 years ago had not seen a lot of, but now is quite literally everywhere. This is the U.S. Treasury. This is the CARES Act and the Coronavirus Relief Fund. All starts with a 21. 84 is the Department of Ed. 93 is another really common one, Health and Human Services. There's a lot of these funds out there now with the way that some of these different agencies got funding through the CARES Act. And then 97 is Homeland Security, or FEMA, rolls up under there. So folks that have been applying for disaster grants and things like that, you'll see 97 as that leading identifier there. This is not all of them. There's obviously Department of Defense, there's USAID for foreign entities, there's all kinds of these other ones, but this, in my experience and in this area, seems to be the most common ones that will pop up. So because it's not simple and no good deed goes unpunished, what is a federal award? Well, some things look like a federal award, but the receiving organization might actually be a contractor or a beneficiary and only be fulfilling a small part of the overall grant award or one specific function of a grant, and it might not actually be a federal award. So now we went through the bother, we figured out where the money came from. We have this FFAL identifying number. So it looks like a duck and it's starting to quack like a duck, but it might not actually be a duck, which is fun. So this is a really subjective area, and you have to review your agreements and your grant documents closely. My old accounting professor beat it into my brain, substance over form. And so you'll read a lot of these documents and they will say subrecipient. And then in the next sentence, they'll say beneficiary, and a couple paragraphs later, it will say contractor. And so those agreements aren't always very clear on, well, what is our relationship as that recipient organization to the grant overall. And so consult with that funding agency. They have some responsibilities on their end to do monitoring if it's really a sub grant, if it's another grant award that they're giving down to you and they think it's a grant, they have responsibilities. If they're using you as a contractor to fulfill a piece of that grant, they have a different responsibility. So be sure to go back to them and ask these kinds of questions. Talk with them, also with your auditors if you're having a single audit. These determinations of what is a federal award and what is not a federal award are key to determining, well, did we make that $750,000 threshold? I've had a few clients that were certain through 2021 that they were going to need a single audit. Oh yeah, we had all this federal money. All this federal money came through, all of it. And we got to December and I said, okay, well, send me the list. And we started picking apart through it and they came in under that $750,000 threshold. And they said, man, we've never been so happy to be wrong in our lives to not have to do this. And so it's key to understand these agreements. So kind of to tag along with that, I kind of tried to build these little flow charts to kind of illustrate what we've been talking about on these last couple slides about what might be a federal award and whatnot. So we'll start up at the top, the federal agency, HUD, and they have a federal financial assistance listing number, that 14.218. 14 is HUD. 218 identifies the Community Development Block Grant, CDBG for short. And this grant, let's say it's for home weatherization in lower income parts of town. And so the city actually applied for this grant, the city of Omaha, and the 5 million is made up. That's just my illustrative purposes. So the city applied for a $5 million grant from HUD. HUD made the grant to the city, and then the city put out grant awards. And so not-for-profit A applied for a $2.5 million grant. And they're fulfilling all function of the grant purpose, meaning they are identifying homes that qualify for this weatherization. They're going through the hurdles to make sure the residents meet any eligibility requirements. And then they're also doing the weatherization themselves. Not-for-profit B over here got a grant for $250,000 from the city out of this same pot of money, and they're doing all the functions of the grant purpose. And so not-for-profit B needs to also then consider other funding that could be federal awards to see whether they got over that $750,000 threshold or not. And so this slide looks almost the same, but the key difference here, so we start again at HUD. They made a $5 million grant to the city. Not-for-profit A, $2.5 million. They're doing it all. They're a subrecipient. That's a federal award to not-for-profit A. But we changed the facts a little bit on not-for-profit B here. We changed the dollars too. So they got $300,000 and they're serving as effectively as a gatekeeper. They're gathering info to assist residents in applying for funding through the city's piece of the grant that they didn't award out. So not-for-profit B is doing things like gathering income eligibility information or information on the home's age and other qualifying things. They're bundling this up in a package, sending that to the city and saying, city, we believe these are ones that qualify. So in this case, not-for-profit B is a contractor. They're not fulfilling the entire purpose of this grant. They're basically, the city has outsourced that eligibility testing or documentation to this other not-for-profit and say, not-for-profit, you manage this for me. I'll do the weatherization. I'll pay for those things, but I want you to kind of be the gatekeeper in this process. Well, again, you have a FFAL identified to that. The city's agreement is going to identify that that's CDBG money. Their document is going to say recipient in it. It's going to likely say subrecipient, but you have to understand the facts and the circumstances of, well, what are we really doing as a part of this this funding stream here? And this one is really applicable with the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. If any of your organizations are participating in that, through Match is the organization in Omaha. There are tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars flying through that program right now. And at different points in time, different organizations that have been participating in that might be contractors, or they might be sub-recipients, and it might be a federal award. So it's really complex, and I can't stress enough how much attention you have to pay to the agreements, and then not only the agreements, but thinking about, well, what are we really doing as part of this grant? So they're not making it easy on us. So now that we have a little background on why are we doing this, what does it involve? What are we doing as part of a single audit, this big, scary new process? And so the uniform guidance, all that excessive language on one of the first slides about what is this uniform guidance? It lays out specific prescriptive requirements on what needs done under a single audit process. And most of those requirements are for me as the auditor. But like plumbing, things roll downhill. And so as the recipients of those federal dollars, my requirements ultimately are then things that you guys have to work with as the receiving agencies. And so from your perspective, from somebody that got the funds, big picture, what are we going to do under this single audit? What do we need to be aware of to get ready for one of these things? So we have to understand our federal awards, which we've been beaten up for about the last 10 or 12 minutes. What are our federal awards? Where did they come from? What is that assistance number? And then creation of this schedule of expenditures of federal awards, the CFA, which is a fancy listing of all of our grants and how much we spent and some of this identifying information. We need to document the internal controls that are relevant to the compliance requirements of this major programs picked by the auditor. And a bunch of that terminology, we're going to get to what that means coming up here in a couple of slides. And then as with any good auditor, we're going to ask for information and copies of documents, invoices, reports, reimbursement requests, different agreements that you have back and forth with the funding agencies. And the last bullet point really kind of is the key to this. It depends by grant. Each grant is so different. What HUD might want under their agreements is completely different than what the USDA might want. So again, the federal government's really helping us out and making this easy for us. There is a listing of information available. It's called the compliance supplement, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit, where there's a lot of good information on these different grants. But it's hard to get more specific than those kind of top three general bullet points. Those sort of things will be applicable to all of them, and then from there it really just depends on the grant. And so from my seat as the auditor, what am I doing as part of this process? And so the first thing we have to do as the auditors, figure out what programs are we going to test? Which ones are we going to dive into? And so you think of somebody like the city of Omaha, or the big public school districts, Omaha Public Schools. There is a ton of federal funding flying through those organizations. The HUD grants at the city, there are EPA Superfund grants, there's coronavirus relief funds coming through. There's lots of federal programs at these really big organizations. And so there's a process that's, again, it's prescriptive. I don't get to pick and choose necessarily to figure out which programs are we going to test. If your nonprofit only has one federal award and it's over $750,000, bingo, that's pretty easy to judge. But if there's more than one, or more than a handful, definitely, we have to go through this risk assessment process. And depending on the results of that risk assessment process, I have to test either 20 or more, or 40% or more of the total federal funds that went through. So here's where we're kind of seeing it's important to know what are all of our federal awards, so we can identify which are the big ones, which ones are we going to have to test. If we need to test 40% of the dollars, how do we get there? And so again, that risk assessment is also prescriptive. I don't get to judge and pick and choose and say, well, I think this one maybe and not that one. It's a process to try and ultimately over time, if you have a lot of ongoing federal programs, to try and touch all of them over a period of time. And so for organizations to where this federal funding is new, or where you've not had single audits in the past, you're automatically a high-risk auditee. Do not pass go, do not collect $200. Your auditor is going to have to test 40%. Again, if that's one grant that you got that was $800,000, easy peasy, we have one grant, we're going to poke on that one. If that's a bunch of $100,000 grants, well, we're probably going to have to dive in on several of them until we can hit that 40% coverage number. It takes into considerations, if you've had single audits before, which programs did we look at before? What was the result? Did we have findings in those programs? Were there issues that might make that program riskier than another program where we haven't had issues? So lots of, I would say judgment, but a prescriptive process to follow to figure out, well, which ones we're going to actually look at. And so once we are able to identify which major program or major programs we're going to look at, then we have to understand these compliance requirements. And so we were talking about that a couple of slides ago. Each grant that the federal government puts out has a set of applicable compliance requirements. And I'm kind of stealing my thunder from the next slide here. So we're going to understand what are these compliance requirements. Then we're going to understand what are your controls as an organization. How are you making sure you meet these compliance requirements that are applicable to your grant? If there's an eligibility provision, if participants in this program have to be under a certain income threshold, how are you ensuring that the only people that participate in this program through your organization meet those requirements? If there are certain things that you're budgeting to spend payroll for, how are you ensuring that the payroll costs that get charged to that grant are the right costs or in line with the grant agreement? And then we're going to document tests of expenditures. If you have report filing requirements, all of these things, we're gonna pick through and test those things to say, is this organization meeting the terms of their grant? And there's an old audit saying, if you didn't document it, you didn't do it. So it ends up with me writing lots of notes and keeping track of everything I looked at and documented, which is my least favorite part of the single audit process from my seat. And so we've been talking about these compliance requirements. There are 12 of them that are possible, and the applicability varies by grant. So again, they're doing us a huge favor and making them all unique and different. The granting agencies are supposed to pick up to 6 of the 12 that are applicable to their various grants that they make. And then they include them as part of this OMB compliance supplement. So it's Office of Management and Budget. You hear about them in the news generally. Congress will reach out to them and ask them to assess what's the budget impact of a bill they're proposing. They're kind of like the weatherman. I don't know if they ever really get it very close to right, but it's the only guess we get out of it sometimes. But so OMB works with all of these different agents, federal agencies, gathers all the information on all the different grants that they're giving out, and says, okay, HUD, if we kind of stick with our example here for this CDBG, what are the 6 compliance requirements that are most applicable to these CDBG grants? And so from there, as the auditor, I will take this and I will look at it and we'll decide and work with you guys as the recipients to decide, well, which of these are really direct and material? Which of these have the biggest impact on the grant? And this is where we're going to focus. So there might be compliance requirements that HUD says this is applicable to the grant. We might together decide this is not direct and material. We're not going to focus on this and spend much time on this. And then that informs the testing that we're going to do, the requests that we're going to make, and those sorts of things. And so these compliance requirements here, here are the 12, and they don't follow quite in alphabetical order because there are 2, I think, that I can see letter D isn't listed. That one used to be a compliance requirement. It used to be 14, and they made a huge concession and went to 12 for us a couple of years ago. So the ones in bold here, A and B and H, we're going to talk about here in a minute. These are the ones that are applicable to virtually every grant. No matter who it comes from, what it's for, almost every grant I have ever seen has these three as potential direct and material compliance requirements. And so A and B are always tied together because they go hand in hand. Activities allowed or unallowed, and then allowable cost. And so what these two are getting at is if you applied for a grant, let's just stick in the vein of that CDBG grant we've been talking about, home weatherization. If you applied for this home weatherization grant and you submitted this budget that said we're going to use 80% of it to weatherize homes and 20% of it is going to cover payroll that it takes for our people to manage this process. Okay, then I would expect as the auditor, when I look at the expenses that you're charging to this grant, they fall into one of those two buckets. It's not flights to Vegas for the executive director. It's not payroll just for individuals not participating in this grant program or process. They're not, they don't work in that area. And then allowable costs, excuse me, relates with that. And again, tied to that budget, we said we were going to spend X dollars on payroll. Okay, well, are we doing that? There's a giant list of things that the federal government will not pay for. They won't pay for advertising. They will not pay for alcoholic beverages are the two that jump to mind right away. So we'll be looking as we make our samples and we're doing our testing of the expenses that you're charging to this grant. Can we see that the things that are getting charged to this grant are not on this sort of prohibited list, if you will. I marked a couple other ones on my slides here, some other really common ones, eligibility. And what that eligibility requirement is always different by grant, but it might be an income threshold or different things like that is a kind of a common one that we see. And another really common one is reporting. Almost all grant that you get have some sort of reporting requirement, whether it's a performance reporting. Here's how we did on meeting our expected outcomes of this grant over the last quarter or the last 6 months or whatever that reporting timeline that you have is. There's financial reporting, having to submit reimbursement requests and different things like that, or program finance reports that might be due quarterly or annually, excuse me, or so on. So again, that eligibility and reporting are other common ones. I see special tests and provisions a lot, which is the catch-all for anything else they want to put attached to the grant. And so that is a fairly common one, but I really can't, they're just all so different. But again, knowing that federal financial assistance number, CDBG 14.218, you can go then out to this compliance supplement and you can find 14.218 and it will show you, HUD will say, I think these are the ones that are applicable to this grant. And then from there you go through and assess where are these most applicable. Cash management is one that's applicable quite a bit of the time. The federal agencies will say cash management's applicable. But what this means is in the instance where you got cash up front, how did you basically manage that cash and ensure that you spent it on the grant quickly, effectively is what that one is saying. But again, pre-pandemic, PC, you have BC, before Christ, AD, and then PC. So PC times, way back, if anybody remembers those, grants were almost always on this reimbursement basis. So cash management might have been applicable. HUD might have said this is an applicable requirement, but as a receiving agency, you're saying, well, I don't get paid by HUD or the city or whoever it is until I submit for reimbursement for them. So we would look at it and say, okay, HUD says this one is applicable, but we'll call this one not direct and material, and we're not even spending time looking at it. So what is the point of all of this? we've been talking for half an hour now about all of the different things that go into it and the nuance and the subtlety and the complexity. So where are we going with all of this? Well, you get a bunch of extra pages in your audited financial statements. And one of those pages is the schedule of expenditures of federal awards. Shows the amounts that you spend under each of the different grants that you have, identifies the federal funding agency, the assistance listing number, and the dollars that go along with that. You get an independent auditor's report on compliance over the major federal programs. That's where we were talking a few slides back about which are the significant grants to test to get that coverage, that 20% or the 40%. And then also is that we're going to look at the internal control over the compliance as required by that uniform guidance. So when we pick the grant and we pick the compliance requirements from that last slide that we're going to look at, part of what we're looking at is the internal controls. And so you're going to get a report that says everything's hunky-dory or we have some problems. And if you keep reading, we'll tell you what those are. And so it's a prescriptive form, outlines any of those findings if we have findings that we get to in that process. And so here's an example. This is actually from the City of Omaha's financial statements. You can go out and Google those if you have trouble sleeping and read through those, if you will. So this is from 2020. And so I know it's kind of hard to see being small here, but on the left, you can see there's a column heading Federal Grantor and Program Title. So Housing and Urban Development. And here's our CDBG grants popping up again. So they got a bunch of different, these are all different grants, but all under that same federal financial assistance listing number. And you can't tell from here what the purpose of all these grants were, but the way they have them listed separately would lead me to believe they're probably all separate purposes here. And then I know it's incredibly hard to see, but at the bottom of that CDBG listing, they have one that says COVID-19 2020 CDBG CV means corona, stands for coronavirus. So they have identified here, they spent some COVID specific funding. So HUD got a pot of money from the federal government under the CARES Act that went to provide additional grants or additional funding outside the normal course of funding to these CDBG grants. And so here you're identifying, oh, this is a COVID specific grant. If we remember back to 2008, when all the economic crash was happening, there was funding that went out under the ARRA program, American Rescue Relief Act. I forget exactly what it stands for, ARRA. We had to identify the funding this way. When you might have an existing CDBG grant that got ARRA funding. So you would have to poke out and say, hey, here's some specific special funding we got in this. And this isn't the entire CFA, but you can see here kind of in the middle, federal assistance listing number, there's our 14.218 that we've been talking about in our slides here. The next grant underneath there is Emergency Solutions Grant. I've seen a lot of organizations getting those over the past 2 years, 18 months, a different listing number. The far column on the right here is the total federal expenditures. So the city spent $4.6 million in total of CDBG grants in calendar 2020. The column immediately to the left of that is what would be applicable to folks on this call pass through to subrecipients. And so what this is identifying, the city is saying, hey, we got a grant for CDBG, and we gave some of it out to others. Other organizations are participating in these grants. And so one of them here, you can, again, the numbers are really hard to read, but there's one for $715,000. They passed out $715,000 of $2.3 million on one of these grants to other agencies. So you're identifying somebody else is on the hook for some of these dollars and some compliance with these also. But wait, there's more. It's like a game show, right? That's not all we get to do. So you get this schedule of findings and question cost also, which is basically a summary of the 4 pages of compliance and control reports that you'll get. And it provides the details of any of those internal control or compliance findings. So the reports were saying, hey, we have a finding, and here's the identifier for it. And then you get back to the schedule of finding and question costs. And if we have these findings, here's where you'll see them. It also IDs what did the auditor select as the major programs, which tells them which ones did they focus on as their process. And then if you have financial statement issues, separate from the single audit related piece, those will pop up too. So if you have material weaknesses or significant deficiencies in your financial statement audit, sort of unrelated to the single audit piece, those will pop up there as well. And so here again, this is out of the City of Omaha's report. They did a good job. So up here, the top, the summary of the auditor's results, the first section here is financial statements. So this doesn't have anything to do with the federal awards piece of it. They got an unmodified opinion, which is the best result that you can get. No material weakness, no significant deficiencies, and no non-compliance related to the financial statements. The next section down, here's where it focuses on the federal awards. And so for the major programs, no material weaknesses, no significant deficiencies, and they got an unmodified report on their federal awards. So hats off to the City of Omaha. They're doing a good job. If we keep looking farther down here, you can see this top section here is where we're identifying the major programs. And so 16.034, coronavirus, that is Department of Justice. 21.019, that is the scourge of my life for the last 2 years. This is the giant coronavirus relief fund that got its hands into everything. And then the last one here is 66.802, the super fund. This is actually from the EPA for lead cleanup in the area. And so you also see here, auditee did qualify as a low risk auditee. So they have had single audits in the past. They've not had findings or issues. There's a few other requirements here. So they're a low risk auditee. So that means those 3 programs that they selected would have had to cover at least 20% of the total federal awards the city had. And then coming down, there's really nothing to see kind of further down there, but it's if you had findings related to your internal controls or your compliance, here's where those would pop up and you would detail out. Again, there's a very prescriptive form. What happened? Why did it happen? What was the cause? What was the effect? And what was the result on the either the financial statements or on the federal award from these findings? And so those get detailed out in this section if you have any of those. And just when you think you're done, you have your financial statement audit, you do a single audit, then you get to do this data collection form. It just never ends, it seems like. And so you're required to complete and submit this data collection form, which is a summary of everything that we just kind of looked through with this sort of reporting package related to the single audits, the reports, the schedule of findings and question costs, and the CFA. And it gets uploaded to a searchable federal database. This is a process, at least in our office, this is something we usually help out with in terms of we'll put it together, you'll review it if you're my client, and then we'll work together to get it submitted. And so there is a website you can go to, the Federal Audit Clearinghouse, and you can do a search by organization. You can do a search by year. You can do a search by that federal ID number. You want to see who else got CDBG funds in the state of Nebraska. You can go out and look for that. And then you can find their audit reports and see how they did. Did they do a good job or not? And so along with that data collection form submission, you're required to submit a copy of the audit report, which is also searchable. So you can go out and find other audit reports. Often if I have a new client, I'll go out here first and pull these data collection forms and pull financial statements and take a look through them and understand what grants has the organization typically had. Have they had problems or issues or findings related to those programs? Kind of helps me know what I'm getting into a little bit in that regard. And so these data collection forms are due 90 days after, or sorry, 30 days after the report date after your fiscal year end. So if you have a calendar year end, let's say you're on the ball, you have your financial statement audit going, you got your single audit done, and it gets issued on March 1st. The audit report date is March 1st. You have 30 days from then to get this data collection form submitted and your financials submitted. The overall requirement on a single audit is that the process for a single audit, including all this data collection form business, has to be done within 9 months of your fiscal year end. So again, if you have a calendar year end, calendar 2021 that just passed, you have until September 30 of 2022 to get your single audit done. A lot of times these go on at the same time as your financial statement audit or very, very close to, and you issue all of that stuff in one fell swoop, and you get your data collection form done, and it goes away until next year. There have been some instances with some of the funding that's gone on lately where there's not good information. If we think back to the hospital funding, the provider relief funds that you hear about, and my office has done a ton of work with these, the rules keep changing. And they're still a little bit in flux. And HHS says, okay, we built this fancy reporting portal, and now we want you to put all your stuff in this reporting portal. But it's not available in a timely fashion related to the grant funding and the year-end deadlines and things. And so there is possibility that your auditor may split things and do what's called a dual dating. They may come in and do the financial statement audit like usual or like regular. If you've not had financial funding or federal funding before, issue everything that you would normally get and then circle back at a later time and do the single audit separate from that, do a reissue and attach all of that extra reporting in extra pages and wrap things up at a later date. So there's some flexibility. It just kind of depends on your organization and what funds you're into or not into, and how that all shakes out. So as we mentioned at the top, the pandemic has made everything hard. Your Amazon shipments take longer, toilet paper shortages, made this complex grant process more difficult, because that's what we all needed, is more difficulty. So we've talked about some of these here on some of the other slides, but funds received in advance of the grant award terms and conditions or any agreements. Literally clients calling me and saying, well, we got this giant pot of money. What are we supposed to do with it? Well, let's sit tight and see what they tell us we're supposed to do with it. HHS at several points during all of this seemed to be, and there was such speed and urgency, and I can appreciate that they did a fantastic job of getting funds into organizations' hands that could make a difference. They did a horrible job telling us what exactly are we supposed to do with these funds, so that we don't run afoul of the rules and get in trouble later and have to pay them all back when we don't have the cash anymore. Changing guidance on what can the funds be used for. Weekly, daily, we would see new guidance from these federal agencies. This is allowable. This is not allowable. Never mind, it's okay again. Months after the funding is gone and spent, changing, but well, we really wanted you to do this with it instead of that. It was impossible. I can appreciate the nightmare this has been for recipient agencies of these funds. And I think probably what's going to happen is you're going to see, if you were to look at the overall sort of scoring on these single audits over a period of time for this pandemic, once they start getting them accumulated, I bet we're going to see that lots of organizations have findings, and probably not for anything they did or didn't do appropriately. This guidance was garbage a lot of times until the program was over and spent and done. And then I got to come around after the fact and say, well, you were supposed to do this with it. And your response would be, well, we didn't know that, wasn't the guidance. And so it's going to be difficult. When we were looking at the city's schedule of expenditures, there was the grant identified COVID-19 CDBG funding. So there were a lot of new programs that came about out of the CARES Act, out of the FFCRA, ARPA that got passed late last year, created some new grant programs, but a lot of what they did was provide additional funding to existing programs. So additional funding to the CDBG program. One that's new is this Coronavirus Relief Fund 21.019 that the city had audited. And I'm going to guess a lot of you organizations on this call got funds under that program at some varying level. But now we have to be able to identify, well, what was the source of that funds? PC, you know, in the old days, pre-COVID, you knew what the source was. It was HUD, it was USDA, it was HHS. Well, now it's HHS and it's this program we've always had, but now we have to be able to figure out, was this funded by the CARES Act? Was this just regular old appropriations from Uncle Sam? And so that's complex. Period of availability, this kind of ties with that changing guidance. It's one of those more common compliance requirements. And what it basically says is, you know, a typical grant award will say, we're giving you this grant award and it's for calendar 2020. And you have $100,000 to spend on your grant in this calendar year. And so you're going to have to make sure that the expenses you charged to it were things you incurred in calendar 2020. And so if you tie some of these complicating factors all together, cash started flowing in April 2020. Here's all this money we're flying around trying to keep the economy going, trying to prepare and respond to COVID and all of these uncertainties. Spend the money, but we're not sure what you're supposed to spend it for. Spend it quick because we want to be stimulating the economy. We want to be making some progress, trying to slow the virus down. And then 6 months after April, October, you'll get some guidance that says, well, you can spend this money even into 2021, or you could go back to February in 2020. Right as all of this was starting to blow up, you can find expenses from back there and charge those into the grant. And so that is incredibly different than the typical process. And so that makes things more complex. My favorite, some programs were federal awards, some weren't. PPP, if you did emergency disaster loans and grants, which was a pain in the neck because one EIDL is a federal award and one is not. That's confusing. Subrecipient versus beneficiary. So we were talking about with those flow charts, the kind of the flow of the dollars from HUD through the city to these different not-for-profits. If you're fulfilling all those terms of the grants, you're a subrecipient. That means it's a federal award to you. You need to consider it for a single audit. You might be a beneficiary of a federal award, which means you have no compliance requirements associated to that. And so federal dollars, but you're not considered a subrecipient. And so it's not something that needs to go on your CFA. I have been back and forth with Nebraska HHS. I think they made some crazy decisions on some of their grants that they gave out under the HHS Community Cares funding. They didn't care to hear my opinion, and I didn't really get anywhere, but I told them what I thought. So some guidance on some of these programs. Again, these are the common ones. These may or may not be applicable to your organization. And I'm going to put my little caveat of I'm not the authoritative source of information on these, but this is some pretty, I don't think I'm taking any risks saying these grants. So PPP, a lot of organizations did PPP. They did 2 rounds of it. It has a federal financial assistance listing number, came through the SBA, government agency. Excuse me, not a federal award. These are grants, yes, ultimately when the funding gets passed through or forgiven, it becomes a grant income sort of thing to your organization, but those are not federal awards. So that does not get considered to whether you make that $750,000 threshold. Employee retention tax credit is another popular program, goes through the IRS. Those are not federal awards. Nebraska HHS Community Cares, there were lots of different funding streams that came out of this. These are the stabilization grants, the $10,000, $12,000 grants that they gave out in a couple different rounds. Also the response and recovery grants that they gave out. And here's where this confusing guidance comes in. They did us a solid and said, round one, stabilization, healthy places grantees. Congratulations, you're a beneficiary. No compliance required. You have compliance requirements. The state wants to know you did what you're supposed to do, but it's not a federal award to you. Oh, but by the way, if you did get one of these response and recovery grants, which are typically bigger dollars than those stabilization grants, yeah, those are federal awards. You are a subrecipient, and now that is subject to being on your CFA. I think they missed the boat with that, but again, they didn't want to hear what I had to say. A lot of organizations got funding from the Omaha Community Foundation, and those monies came through Douglas County. It came from the CARES Act and went to the county. The county used OCF to help distribute those dollars, not federal awards. Again, more confusion and making things hard. If you had an EIDL grant for $10,000 from the SBA, not a federal award. If you did an EIDL loan through the SBA, congratulations, that's a federal award. And then another one that we've seen pop up lately is the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant, and that's also through the SBA. That one is a federal award. And so just tons and tons of complexity in this. Again, it's talk early, talk often with your auditors when you're kind of trying to determine what applies to your organization or doesn't apply.
Thanks so much, Justin. I know we have a few more slides with resources, but there are a few questions in the chat. So do we want to make sure we save some time for those, or?
Yes, let's do those. And those
Perfect.
resources really, they're kind of self-explanatory. They're, if you're an accounting nerd like me, you'll enjoy reading those. And if you're not, well, there's pretty boring, pretty dry stuff. So they're in there and they're available for you. But yeah, certainly let's handle some questions.